The US was not present when global leaders pledged to double down on racism. Meanwhile, the Honduras president publicly denied drugs trafficking allegations. World leaders at the UN General Assembly in New York on Wednesday recommitted efforts to stamp out racism. The commitment marked the anniversary of a 2001 South African anti-racism conference. UN member countries said that while progress had been made, there had been a rise in discrimination and violence against people of African heritage, Roma, and refugees. What did the UN say about racism? The Assembly called for national institutions to adopt adequate reparation or satisfaction for people with African heritage in a meeting on racial justice. Millions of the descendants of Africans who were sold into slavery remain trapped in lives of underdevelopment, disadvantage, discrimination, and poverty, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said in a video message. Ramaphosa called the years of slavery one of the darkest periods in the history of humankind and a crime of unparalleled barbarity. President Felix Tshisekedi of Congo asked the UN to look into the reparations for the scars of racial inequality, subordination, and discrimination, which were built under slavery, apartheid, and colonialism. Tshisekedi added that this discrimination was still apparent in the lack of vaccines available to African people, with only 1 in 1,000 people having got at least a shot so far in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Assembly also called for an end to religious and disability discrimination. Why was there disagreement? The US and Israel were 2 of 19 nations that did not attend Wednesday's meeting because the UN Anti-Racism Conference in 2001 had decided to include Palestinians as a discriminated people. The UN only adopted the 2001 Anti-Racism Declaration, called the DDPA for short, when the US and Israel walked out during the meeting in Durban, South Africa. In a separate meeting, the Israeli ambassador called the 2001 accord radical anti-Semitism, while U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield said the Biden administration would look for more inclusive ways of fighting racism. Jamil Dakwar of the American Civil Liberties Union criticized the U.S. no-show at the meeting, saying it sends the wrong to the global community regarding the U.S. commitment to fight all forms of racism and racial injustice everywhere. Jamaica attended the meeting but said there were not enough slavery reparations in a new UN document being drafted against racism. What other matters were raised? U.S. President Joe Biden pledged to increase COVID-19 vaccine donations to 500 million shots, just a day after China announced its decision to give 2 billion shots to poor countries. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta said he wanted to introduce fair, inclusive, and effective multilateral systems during his presidency of the UN Security Council next month. He said he will push for more women peacekeepers and look at the impact of illicit small arms on global peacekeeping missions. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said the US is failing to meet its obligations on helping refugees from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. After taking on nearly 4 million refugees, mainly from Syria, and more recently, 300,000 Afghans, he said he could not allow any more migrants into Turkey. Honduras President Juan Orlando Hernandez defended himself against allegations he took bribes from drug traffickers. A Manhattan federal court imprisoned his brother, Juan Antonio Tony Hernandez, for life last March for being part of one of the biggest drug conspiracies. He said he was implacable on organized crime and accused criminals of perjury for implicating him in drug trafficking. JC/A, AP, Reuters, DPA.
In a game, every player begins at the same starting point. They all get the same number of chances. The rules are clear. So whether you win or lose depends more on strategy and luck. We like to think that's also true of the labor market, that anyone's hard work can pay off. But that's not the case, especially for some groups, like people of color.
In
Germany, we still ask the question, where are you from, far too often. People aren't asking, who are you and where do you want your career to take you? Where you come from still plays a role in our discourse and our attitudes.
And in hiring too. It's a problem that mostly affects ethnic minorities, and they often face similar barriers in the workplace. That's also why blacks and people of color are more likely to end up in lower skilled and lower paid careers. The picture is very different at the top. Corporate boardrooms in Germany, much like in France, the UK and the US, don't reflect the societies they come from. At this level of leadership, there's little by way of racial diversity. And yet the words race, ethnicity and racism are missing from discussions about diversity in corporate Germany.
Es ist aber eben eindeutig feststellbar.
It's definitely the case that most companies and most employers avoid using the word racism. They think it's a dangerous word, and it expresses something that doesn't apply to them.
Etwas aus, was auf sie nicht zutrifft.
So there's still a lot of education to be done.
Aufklärung betrieben werden.
And Germany is not alone in that. The European Network Against Racism says ethnic minorities and migrants of color especially face significant discrimination across Europe. What is the common type of exclusion that you see from the labor market in Europe?
What we see is that racialized groups, racialized individuals might have a very high level of experience and qualifications, but they are actually in low-level, low-qualified jobs. And there's also this risk of exploitation for certain groups. When you get into the more corporate sectors, you see that there is wage disparities according to different racialized groups, where white people may earn more money doing the same work.
And unemployment rates are also higher for people of color and ethnic minorities.
You can see that there is a difference between the national unemployment rate and the unemployment rate for migrants, with the unemployment rate for migrants being higher. So you see in different countries that ethnic minorities might be experiencing exclusion from the labour market based on various different reasons, whether that's due to the population in that specific country or the history of colonialism, the history of slavery that we know exists in Europe.
The global discussion on racism has shifted since the killing of George Floyd in May 2020 in the US triggered a wave of Black Lives Matter protests, which reverberated across the globe. Thousands gathered in solidarity in cities across Europe, while also calling for racial justice at home. The protests have changed how many US companies are responding to social justice movements. Several American brands issued statements supporting the calls for racial justice from the Black Lives Matter movement. By August 2020, corporate America reportedly pledged more than $7 billion to support efforts to fight racism.
Leaders recognized they were in a position of influence, but also there was a demand if they wanted to keep their consumers happy with their products and services.
Corporations are really the most powerful entity within society that have immense influence over policy, over workers, over a host of issues that our society wrestles with.
Chris Miller works for ice cream maker Ben & Jerry's, heading the company's social justice campaigns. The company took a stand on racial justice years ago. It began supporting the Black Lives Matter movement in 2016. Still, the events of last year changed everything.
The murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests showed was that there was increasing expectation and perhaps a redefinition around what it means to be a corporate citizen. We cannot address the underlying racism that exists, the systemic and structural nature of it, unless we can admit that racism exists, whether it's the movement around the rights and dignity of asylum seekers and refugees in Europe, or for that matter, the work that we're doing around climate justice in Australia.
Corporate America is advertising its efforts to grapple with racism and to engage with society on questions of racial justice. In Europe, things are a bit more complicated. Many researchers, anti-racism activists, and diversity experts say that European companies still haven't engaged with the reality of racism.
The lack of data in many European countries to show the effect and the impact of racial discrimination helps corporates avoid this issue in Europe.
The biggest opportunity is capturing all the information that's out there around different ethnic groups, racial groups, and with that valuable data or information, companies can do wonders in the sense of recognizing where they're challenged.
To solve this, we have to create very transparent hiring situations. There needs to be that mutual respect.
Of discrimination. It's like playing a game where the rules are always changing and you end up being excluded without knowing what the real rules are.